Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm Karan and today I speak with Ben Rubin, Executive Director and co-founder of the Carbon Business Council. We explore his 5,000-mile climate tour, the founding of CBC, and its policy work. Ben also discusses CBC's latest report on utilities and carbon removal, along with his hopes for future policy. Tune in for viable insights. Hello, everybody. Today, we are honored to be joined by Ben Rubin with the Carbon Business Council. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to join the podcast. Really appreciate and grateful to have you on. Looking forward to diving into your journey, the important work that you're up to these days. But before getting into that, I have to ask about your 5,000-mile bus tour, visiting cities like Miami, New Orleans, and San Francisco for the 2018 Global Climate Action Summit. Such a cool experience. Could you just talk a little bit about what encouraged that and what that was like?
Yeah, happy to jump into that. And thanks so much for having me here. Looking forward to the conversation today and the opportunity to talk about climate change and carbon removal. And happy to begin with that Freedom to Breathe tour. So like you said, it was a 5,000-mile journey. We drove through the US, and part of it was to stop in different communities to spotlight how climate change is playing out at the local level in the US. Climate change is fundamentally a local issue. And so we were looking at different climate impacts, some of the disproportionate climate impacts in some communities, but also how communities, there is resiliency of communities, how some communities are responding, driving locally led solutions. And it was excellent to meet with different folks and see how climate change is playing out. Definitely a formative opportunity. It was a privilege and a pleasure to be able to be a part of that tour. And as it relates to carbon removal now, I think helps bring in a similar vantage point of carbon removal playing out at the local community level. How are different communities going to respond? Where are different carbon removal projects going to make sense? And ultimately, for carbon removal, we ask the question at the community level, how do we maximize the benefits for communities and how do we minimize the risks are some of the guiding lights that we're looking at when it comes to CDR deployment, both in the US and around the world.
It makes a lot of sense. So during this tour itself, you'd go from city to city, and then you would meet with different stakeholders in those cities to learn about what issues they were dealing with?
That's exactly it. Yeah, we were meeting with local community members with a spotlight on what issues might be facing the community. And so in Miami, there was a focus on sea level rise and how Miami is approaching that. Along the Gulf Coast, it was a different set of issues. And in Denver, where we stopped, it was a different set of issues. So it was meeting with community members. In some areas, we were able to work with...
Such a cool experience.
It was great. Yeah, we were able to work with some community groups and organize town halls to spotlight talking about climate change. So yeah, it was great and definitely inspiring to see the local leaders who were really making a difference in their communities for climate action.
Yeah, were there any unexpected insights that were gleaned for you during that? I mean, I'm sure there are probably just surely by traveling across the country and hearing from different groups within those super diverse cities. I feel like I could learn so much by doing something like that. And that's an experience that is kind of once in a lifetime.
Yeah. I think seeing the points of connection that climate change it's a global challenge. In addition to the communities that we visited in the US over that 5,000-mile drive, there's climate issues playing out across the world.
Yeah.
And so we see that red thread of climate running throughout, and then we see how climate is impacting different communities in different ways based on what the climate impacts might be, based on the opportunities the community might have to respond to it. And so in the case of the tour was largely focused on the emissions reduction side of climate. But if we take it and apply that carbon removal lens, different communities are going to have different opportunities when it comes to carbon removal. We could think of one community, if they're along the coast, there's an opportunity for marine carbon removal deployment. If there's a community that has storage for geologic storage, there's opportunities for geologic storage of CO2. And so it plays out in different ways, but then these points of commonality, cohesion, and connection, I do think is a great red thread that runs through it all.
Makes a lot of sense. So what was the genesis of the launch of the Carbon Business Council?
So I think, like a lot of other folks, was really galvanized by a call to action that came out in a United Nations report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018. And in that report, the IPCC concluded that the world had delayed reducing emissions for so long that to hit the agreements, to hit the climate targets that world leaders have agreed to, carbon removal entered the picture as this essential part of the equation. And so it's carbon removal with reducing emissions. It's both working together. Emissions reductions have outsized importance, but carbon removal entered the climate conversation. Yeah. And when we're thinking about scaling up carbon removal, it takes an ecosystem approach. It takes a little bit from everyone, including those local communities we were talking about, including policymakers, including academic research, including science. I think what we're seeing is one of the really exciting, high impact, high growth areas is among the entrepreneurs who are driving the solutions forward, who are working on developing the carbon removal pathways that are going to help us make a gigaton scale impact on the climate. And so the genesis and idea of the Carbon Business Council and talking with the startup leaders who are developing different CDR solutions is really that a rising tide can raise all ships when it comes to carbon removal deployment, that by working together, we could accelerate action. And so it was with that cohesion, that desire for collaboration, that we built the carbon removal ecosystem, which has been a great journey, that the coalition has grown to more than 100 companies working in carbon removal and just doing such invigorating, meaningful work to scale up and make a difference in the climate.
It's over how many years? Again, the 100 companies that you were able to...
Yeah, we've been going for about 3 years now. And so it's been really rapid growth. And the growth reflects the IPCC has given a tight deadline to get to gigaton scale removals. And so it means a lot of work happening each year because there's no time to waste.
That makes a lot of sense. If you could go back to yourself and talk to yourself 3 years ago as you were standing up this important organization, just reflecting through the lens of your experience and having the benefit of hindsight, is there any piece of advice that you'd give yourself at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the Carbon Business Council has been a great proof point that there's a desire for commonality, that folks want to come together and collaborate. And I think to be reminded of that in any element of climate change or when it comes to various carbon removal deployments, finding that commonality, finding that common language, that there can be a way to work together. That example I gave of a rising tide raising all ships, seeing that borne out, seeing companies across different carbon removal pathways want to come together and in a good faith way just accelerate the entire ecosystem has been really exciting to see. And so I think to be reminded of that human desire for collaboration and cohesion has been excellent. And so to be reminded of that is great because we need that kind of connectivity to get to the levels we want to go to.
You'd reiterate the importance of that as you were getting started, to like re-emphasize the conviction, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's an important reminder for folks in the space working on any prong of climate, whatever it might be, between resiliency or anything else, to find that commonality and find that common ground is an important part of the equation.
Makes a lot of sense. What about in terms of the logistics of actually setting it up and like executing on the mission of the Carbon Business Council? Just curious, like any insights as it pertains to actually launching the organization?
That's a great question. Yeah, happy to expand on that. I think one of the things that we did early on was we went through a discovery process. We were talking with different carbon removal companies in the space and understanding is there? Is there a gap in the ecosystem? We thought there was, and the startups confirmed that there was. Is there a desire to collaborate together? Yes. What are the biggest pain points? What are the biggest benefits that a trade association can provide? And being able to hear that directly from the leaders of these companies, so important. That discovery process isn't unique to the carbon removal space. That's important for all startups to go through and whatever their journey is know more about the market and who you're trying to reach and what you're trying to do. And so I think that discovery process was really critical to go through, as well as the team build out being so critical. We were fortunate to have a great board of directors, a great group of a board of advisors to provide early support and really help chart out that vision of where we wanted to get to and lay that foundation to have the right infrastructure early on to position us for the growth and where we wanted to get to have that mission-oriented vision of bringing people together to accelerate the efforts to responsibly scale carbon removal.
It's amazing and so important. I feel like a lot of people enter launching new initiatives with an idea and with a solution in a sense, without necessarily taking the time to really understand the customer needs. And it seems like your customer discovery process is like very intentional. Um, so how long was this process for you? Like how many people did you end up meeting with? Like what were some of the questions? Can you just like provide a little bit more specific detail?
Yeah, and agreed with you. I do think that discovery, whatever the founder, if folks are listening who are thinking about working on a startup, a climate tech startup, understanding the market segment and everything else, and that takes research, some of which can be done online, but hearing directly from folks, talking with the CEOs that we spoke with at companies to understand those pain points, where the value proposition was of a trade association and everything else was great. We had dozens of conversations, and we prioritized diversity in those conversations. We wanted to hear from a diversity of startups, and that meant geographic diversity. It meant a diversity of different carbon removal pathways. It meant hearing from a diversity of funders and different backgrounds, and finding what those points of cohesion were factored into the DNA of the Carbon Business Council. It confirmed for us our hypothesis that there was a gap in the market and a desire for folks to work more closely together. And it's informed some of the core competencies of what we do as a trade association to this day, hearing from the CEOs, and not only going through a discovery in the pre-phase, but I think also continuing to make sure that two-way line is open, hearing from the startups about what they're needing today, hearing from them about what they're going to be needing tomorrow as the market itself continues to mature and evolve.
How did you put together that team? I'm always infatuated by how people get mentors, like get agreement from people to like commit their time to supporting a new initiative.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And it was a point that you made when we were chatting earlier today that I think is true in the climate space, is that I find that generally folks have a willing desire to want to connect, collaborate, and that there is this mission-driven, we have a problem on our hands and let's do what we need to do to move forward. And so I think that ability to be able to work across boundaries, work across ecosystems, and bring folks together is great. And that can start through folks' personal networks. It can start through folks, if there are people listening who are thinking about building up their own venture. It can start with going to networking events, something like Climate Week that we're at this week. It can begin with just reaching out to folks on LinkedIn. But I think just expanding that network, reaching out to folks and identifying how you want to build up a team, what gaps there are, the gaps you're trying to fill, it's a great way to kick off a journey for folks who are thinking about entering into the space in some way.
One more follow-up. So when you were approaching building your board, how did it actually unfold? So what was the ask? And like, how did those conversations go? Was it a situation where once you got the first few, then more people were willing to join? And yeah, can you just walk us through how that process unfolded?
Yeah, definitely excited by the talent and the caliber and the skill sets of our board members and what they're able to bring into the association. I think it just began with conversations about understanding where the vision of the organization and where it was going. If folks felt like there was a good mutual fit based on their skill sets and what they had to offer, and just continuing to evolve and talk through what it would look like. And the conversation obviously continues with the board members as we have board meetings and are charting through what the future and the growth of the organization is going to look like, what the biggest priorities will be in the years ahead. And so I think it's just really some of the team building characteristics that we've been talking about of assembling folks, bringing them together and creating that cohesion and commonality.
Got it. Thank you for expanding on that. And as it pertains to the current work streams of the Carbon Business Council, so how do you look at the structure of the organization? Where are you prioritizing your resources? Can you just give a general overview?
Yeah, happy to do that. So we're broadly thinking about how do we responsibly accelerate the growth of carbon removal? And in answering that question, it helps explain our different work streams, which are broadly aimed around doing that. One is to be an ecosystem builder and a convener. And so that means bringing together folks during something like a Climate Week. We co-hosted a reception. We were able to have several hundred people attend that. The kind of conversations that can happen in an event like that between a startup and an investor, or a policymaker and a scientist, or all the other dozens of connections that were made, that ecosystem building is such an important part of it. We do also think through policy. We have policy working groups that will formulate policy positions, work on issue briefs. We'll socialize that with policymakers to help advance carbon removal on the policy front. We work on communications. How do we talk about carbon removal?
Mm-hmm.
What's the messaging around carbon removal? We do stakeholder engagement. So have a lot of different work streams. Another one that is actively moving forward is a work stream on responsible deployment. We run an online training, CDR RDT, the responsible deployment training, and that's free. It's online. It's on the website, and it's really an opportunity for founders to dig into how should they think about community outreach early in a project? What does a responsible deployment of carbon removal mean? It's introductory. It's covering some of the basics, but there's additional resources on the website for folks to take a deeper dive, read up, and we think that responsible deployment angle of carbon removal is really critical to the long-term growth of the ecosystem, getting communities on board, supportive, making sure that benefits are maximized in local communities.
What are like the top 3 learnings that one would take away from that training?
I think it's divided into different modules, and I think there's some introductory stuff of the kind of why is responsible deployment important? Why does community engagement matter? And so if folks are new to the issue and wondering about those intersections, that's just a great place to start to get updated on that. How to begin community outreach and what that looks like is, I think, an important part of the training. And as far as responsible deployment goes, there's a community element to this, but then there's also talking about some of the larger, what does the responsible deployment of carbon removal look like? We also, it's referenced in the training, we also have an ethical oath to restore the earth that we invite our members to sign on to, where we've gotten a lot of signatures, just talking about how to ensure that removals work in tandem with reducing emissions. And so some of these larger conversations are important too. They're socialized and talked about in the training.
Got it. And on the policy front, which you mentioned is one of your important work streams, as I understand it, you recently released a report yesterday. Could you talk a little bit about that report?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking about that. We're definitely excited to bring this report into the world. As we're thinking about that question I was asking, how do we accelerate the growth of the carbon removal market? This report is focusing on the intersection between utilities and carbon removal. Ultimately, there's a question, and this plays out on the policy side. On the policy side, we're asking, how do we increase demand for carbon removal? We can see that through policy on the public sector side. The U.S. federal government is a purchaser of carbon removal. That's helping to grow the market. Additional sectors on the private side of the equation are also procuring carbon removal. Something that we were excited about in releasing this white paper about utilities is there's so many intersections between utilities and carbon removal for how they can grow the market. And that's everything from thinking about utilities as investors to with the land that utilities have, can that be a place for deployment of carbon removal projects? With some of the assets utilities have, can that play into deploying carbon removal? There's just so many connections that the report honors. And since releasing it, it's already started sparking some really great conversations about trying to make those points of connection. And really, it's through the same lens. How do we grow and scale the carbon removal market? And so we're excited about those linkages from the report. And that's also online if we want to link to that in the show notes as well. And would encourage folks to dig in. Yeah.
That's great that it's accessible and is free of charge.
Free of charge. Yeah.
Oh, it's so nice
we are
of you
putting
guys.
putting it out in the public good for
Amazing. And sticking on this thread for a second, utilities' relationship with carbon removal. So in your interactions with utility companies, have you perceived that they are excited about carbon removal technologies? And what are some of their hesitations, if any, that have come up in those conversations?
Yeah, it's a great question. We spoke with several experts, including utility companies, as we were putting together the report. And I think one of the things that was coming across is just how carbon removal can fit into utilities' existing business model. And so there's one example of direct air capture powered by needs low cost and clean energy to operate. That's an asset that utilities have. There's this other example of some utilities right now are going through a process of doing thinning around transmission lines to reduce wildfire risk. That, on the one hand, could be thought of as a waste product. On the other hand, that material can be used as a feedstock for certain carbon removal pathways. And so the synergies just start to go on. And I think utilities are increasingly seeing that business case, that business opportunity to dive into the carbon removal market. So folks we were chatting with there was enthusiasm. I think the challenge and part of our impetus in putting out the report is just to increase awareness of these opportunities, make sure that utilities in the US and around the world are aware of what can happen so that we can make sure that the market is continuing to move forward.
Regarding the awareness piece, in the carbon removal space itself, there are many different technologies that would constitute as a carbon removal technology. Could you just provide a high-level overview of the different technologies that are currently breaking through in the carbon removal space?
Happy to do that. And I think one thing that I'll highlight too about the Carbon Business Council is we're a technology neutral organization. We support all the different types of carbon removal pathways out there, both some of the prominent ones that folks may have heard about today, as well as some of the emerging methods. And essentially what that translates to in the policy sector is let's have a level playing field right now to spur innovation across the board so that an entrepreneur who wants to focus on X carbon removal pathway has the incentive and resources to do that and see capital in the private sector, and someone wanting to work on Y carbon removal pathway has the opportunities to do that. And so we're seeing really exciting carbon removal deployment happening across the board. I think at a high level, when it comes to what are the different opportunities to get CO2 out of the atmosphere, there's a plethora of pathways that would get somewhat dense and technical if I walk them all, but we see it playing out through some characterizations are, you can remove CO2 through air. And so you get into something like direct air capture. You can remove CO2 through water. And then you get into a host of different marine carbon removal pathways. You can remove CO2 through rock. And we can talk about enhanced weathering there and spreading out rocks across soil. You can remove it through land. And then we can talk about biochar and some of the different land-based methods. And so there's a variety of pathways. And some of it, when it translates into the policy front, is just leaving the door open again for this entrepreneurship and innovation to develop the plethora of pathways that exist.
That makes a lot of sense. And as it pertains to how much carbon and like where that carbon is and where it needs to be removed from, are there like percentage allocations in terms of like X amount of carbon that's being released today is in the air and X amount is in the ground? Because I think it would just provide a helpful undergirding layer for people to be able to comprehend the vastness of the carbon removal space. Or if there's any other framing that you think would be helpful for people who are just getting introduced to carbon removal, for how they should think about where the opportunities are within carbon removal to focus their efforts.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple of different ways to look at it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear them.
There's so many different numbers or ways to think about it. Carbon removal itself is projected to grow into a $1 trillion industry. And I think the fact that it's projected for such rapid growth is an indication of the fact that we need significant amounts of carbon removal, a significant amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere right now that has to come out. I think one way to look at the numbers on a more granular front is carbon removal enters the picture for governments who have a net zero pledge or private companies who have a net zero pledge. Of if you have a net zero pledge and you're trying to balance out your emissions and reach zero, you can get a lot of the way there through reducing emissions. And we come back to removals working in tandem with reducing emissions. Reduce emissions as much as you can, and then there's going to be a certain amount for emissions that are hard to abate, or if someone has a net negative pledge and they want to remove historic emissions, where carbon removal enters into the picture. And so as we start quantifying that, we can look at if a country has a nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement of reading through that, how much CO2 are they counting on for each country? If a corporation has a net zero pledge, how much CDR are they counting on? And then you can start to add up and see where the whole market is going. But it comes down to companies or governments who are committed to net zero, who are working on this, where carbon removal enters into the picture. And then when you start to add that all together, you get the global state of the industry, the global need to remove gigatons of CDR from the atmosphere each year.
Got it. What are you most excited about in the carbon removal space today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the energy that exists in the space right now is really exciting, because I think with that energy, we're going to see the increased demand that we want to see for carbon removal that continues scaling. With that energy, we see more entrepreneurs deciding to dive into the space. We see more investment coming into the space. We see policymakers wanting to jump into this and support more policies that can boost up the carbon removal market. And so I think that energy that's existing around carbon removal right now is just across the board makes it an exciting time for folks who are curious to learn more or wanting to jump in themselves. It's a really great time to enter into the ecosystem and be a part of the build out of this effort to scale up and remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
Yeah, because the infrastructure bill and the IRA both helped provide a lot of funding into carbon removal technologies. Um, so as a result, it's very uh, it's very like there's a lot of energy, a lot of companies forming, a lot of investors coming into the space because those two bills, from my understanding, for example, helped bump up the tax incentive to $185 for direct air capture technology, up from $50 in the IRA. Also extended the lifespan within which a company could actually be able to tap into, extended it to 2032, where you need to break ground before then in order to qualify, and also lowered the threshold. Like, what do you hope on the policy side to happen to continue to build on this energy?
Yeah, you've done your homework. You did a great job summarizing some of these opportunities that do exist right now in carbon removal. And I also liked what you were saying too about where the public sector intersects with the private sector and where those investors intersect with startups and where that intersects with buyers. It is ultimately an ecosystem approach for how we're going to scale the market. I think there's a lot of policy conversations right now about how do we create this level playing field for carbon removal. That tax incentive you were referencing, that certain forms of carbon removal are eligible under that tax incentive 45Q, but not others. And so can we have a tax incentive that allows for multiple forms of carbon removal to be able to come in and have that? When we're talking about the level playing field too, there might be different permitting frameworks that play out for different CDR pathways. If we're talking about a permit for a marine carbon removal project that's in the ocean, that might be different than a permit for a direct air capture plant. And so continuing to think through how to just keep everything moving forward across the board and have that level playing field. A lot of policy conversations happening around that. And I think there's a theme to policy conversations today too about how do we, the second item is, how do we boost demand for carbon removal and how can policy help do that? And so we're seeing right now at the US Department of Energy a really exciting groundbreaking procurement program for carbon removal where the US federal government is actually purchasing carbon removal. There's been bills and legislation floated to increase that amount for procurement. Other countries are thinking about jumping into that as well. But across the board, how can policy boost demand is a really important conversation right now because both the private and public sector can help incentivize and create demand for carbon removal, help create that demand that's going to drive the startups that are around today to scale and grow even faster and create new startups to enter into the market.
How does the process actually unfold with engaging with policyholders and connecting them to people in industry, educating them, as you said earlier, with reports? Like, what does that actually look like on the ground? Do you generally visit the Hill a certain amount of times a year? Or do you hold roundtables? Could you just walk us through the tangible actions that the Carbon Business Council takes to ultimately help policymakers move in the right direction as it pertains to implementing good carbon removal policy?
Yeah, you were touching on, with your examples, you were touching on a bunch of the stuff we do. A lot of the resources that we have are public and they're on the website because they exist for policymakers, they exist for the general public, they exist for scientists, anyone who wants to check out some of our different issue briefs on defining carbon removal or an issue brief on the importance of monitoring, reporting, and verification. And so when we prepare these briefs, when we prepare these reports, we like to socialize them and share them as a resource. And we typically get great feedback from a broad constituency, and that includes policymakers who are working to do a deeper dive into carbon removal. We've had an opportunity to do briefings with policymakers. We've had members of Congress come and participate in in-person conferences that we've done and in briefings with our membership. And so it's, I think, just about being able to be a resource and creating a dialogue so that we can make the right points of connection between startups and help fill in any gaps that might exist in the ecosystem as far as providing technical knowledge on any one thing. And so it's a whole host of different ways, but ultimately with this eye towards how do we responsibly scale up the carbon removal?
Got it. What about at the state level? Are there any states that you point to as pioneering examples of implementing really favorable carbon removal policy?
Yeah, states are increasingly jumping into it, and states are exciting because they can be a real laboratory for then seeing multiple states adopt a state policy that is passed, and so there is a lot happening at the state level. California has passed legislation around carbon removal. Washington State has passed efforts around it, and we're also seeing activity on the East Coast. And so state lawmakers are certainly thinking about this, as well as carbon removal is global in nature. And so we're also seeing countries, in addition, that we've been talking a lot about policy in the U.S., but there's countries around the world who are increasingly thinking about policies for carbon removal. We've got conversations around the carbon removal certification framework in the European Union. Countries in the global south are jumping into the conversation and creating policy frameworks, and startups are being incorporated all over the world. And so there is just certainly a hotbed of activity across the carbon removal ecosystem.
I feel like the EU must be like pretty at the forefront in the carbon. I mean, that's just a hypothesis. I haven't really looked into EU policy in carbon removal, but my sense is that given their pioneering work across other sustainable policy areas, they likely have some interesting and innovative policies going on in carbon removal. Can you speak to that? Or
Yeah, Europe certainly does. And I think right now it's great to just see different governments seeing leadership opportunities in carbon removal and wanting to work on it. In Europe, one of the biggest activities is a carbon removal certification framework that's playing out right now across the European Union. Different countries within Europe are working on their own carbon removal policy. I think something that is great as one way to tie it all together is the US and about 20 other countries are part of what's called the Carbon Management Challenge. And that's a forum for different countries to work together so that the conversation that might be playing out about policy in Canada, as one example, they're a member of the Carbon Management Challenge, that the line is open with policymakers directly about where there can be synergies in policy and where there can be commonality so that we are speaking a common language when we're scaling up the carbon removal ecosystem.
So now shifting gears slightly, thank you for all the information on the policy front. Of course, economics will be a really important factor as it relates to the growth of carbon removal. And just from my research, I was finding that the economics of carbon removal are like pretty complex, given that there's so many different technologies, which we've touched upon, and mineralization all facing unique cost and scalability challenges. How's the Carbon Business Council working to address the economic barriers to deploying these technologies at scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think part of this comes back to the policy conversation and the economic conversation comes back to this question and this theme we've been talking about of demand. How do we have more demand for carbon removal? Because the more demand there is, the more that we want to see the cost of removals today come down. And so if we look at the technology cost curve of solar dropping, the cost of DNA sequencing dropping, the cost of 3D printing dropping, ultimately, how is there R&D and support for carbon removal to also drop down in price? And so I think one of the questions is how, through that R&D, how can we bring down the cost? And we're already seeing some of the costs dropping down. We're already seeing some innovations happening in the space. Another trend that we're seeing in the market is that some buyers are taking a portfolio approach when they're purchasing carbon removal, and that can land them at a blended ton dollar amount that can bring in some forms of carbon removal that might be more expensive, some forms of carbon removal that might be lower, to just make that strong economic case to be able to have that best available deal possible. So certainly making it work on the economic side is a really important part of the equation.
So are you seeing more demand on the buyer front, like over the past few years since the Carbon Business Council has been vamped up?
We are seeing a healthy amount of demand in the market, which is great. We're seeing buyers jumping in and purchasing carbon removal. And for anyone with a net zero pledge out there, and there's many, many net zero pledges in the world, carbon removal increasingly enters into the conversation. I think there are active conversations about how do we further increase demand. And so that is that there can be increased demand from both the public and private sector. And then we're talking about a global market. And so there is demand today, but how do we increase that so that there's even more demand is an important and active part of the conversation.
Yeah, it's so important. And especially from corporates, I feel like there have been so many pledges over the past few years for very large corporates to go net zero. And my sense is that they must be at least just keeping vigilance on what's occurring in the carbon removal space in order to help them reach those targets.
Agreed. There are corporates who are actively jumping in. There are corporates who are following the carbon removal news. We also put out a biweekly newsletter called the Carbon Fix, where every 2 weeks we're summing up the state of the market, the startups who've raised new money, but also the policy trends that are happening. But importantly in that, it's also tracking the carbon removal sales that are happening. And every time we put out the newsletter, there's generally a new deal to announce of a corporation announcing that they've purchased carbon removal credits. And it's so we're actively seeing it take place, the market taking shape.
Any notable deals of late that come to mind?
Each week, deals are made, which is great. And I think we're seeing them play out across sectors. Just this week, British Airways announced a deal on carbon removal. Last week, the week before that, another deal. The week before that, another deal. And so a whole
We will link this newsletter for sure. And I look forward to subscribing to it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good bite-sized way to just stay up to date with all the latest news. And every time we're putting it together, like the team, we're just amazed by and inspired by the amount of activity happening on week to week. It's a vibrant ecosystem right now in the carbon removal space.
So now shifting from corporates to small corporates, aka startups.
Yeah.
Having advised numerous early stage companies in the climate tech space, what common qualities or strategies have you observed in the most successful startups addressing carbon removal?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's exciting to see startups building such high-powered teams, really seeing startups with co-founders who have really synergistic and complementary personalities and that they can accelerate stuff. I see founders really being closely adhered to the science. There's such a wealth of information about carbon removal in the scientific process. And so we're seeing folks with PhD backgrounds coming in and jumping into the space. And so being underpinned by science, building out and finding the right team. And then I think also it's exciting to see startups, whether they're early stage or later in their journey, if pre-seed or they've gotten through a Series A or they've gotten through a Series B, wanting to come and find ecosystem connections to join groups like the Carbon Business Council and some of the other coalitions that exist for startups to just be able to come together and then accelerate their actions. That when it comes to climate change, it's so interconnected that they don't have to go at this alone, and seeking out that commonality, seeking out that collaboration is another way that I think they're able to scale and accelerate the process.
You could give one piece of advice, because we have a lot of listeners who aren't currently working in the climate space, but are interested in getting involved. And a select group likely also are keeping their eye on carbon removal, direct air capture, just a subset of carbon removal, and are looking for ways they can contribute within the space. And it seems like there's a lot of action happening, a lot of different stakeholder groups, from the policy to the corporates to the financiers, you name it. If you could give one piece of advice for someone who's trying to figure out where they would fit in, what would that be?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I like some of the examples you were giving in it, which I think is part of the answer is whatever someone's skill set might be, there is a way to jump in and be a part of the carbon removal space if that's the part of climate change that someone feels called to work on, and that there's just all types of opportunities. If someone has a background in finance, there's an opportunity for them in carbon removal. If someone has a background in a PhD of some scientific type, there's an opportunity to jump in and work on carbon removal. If someone brings whatever lens someone might bring, there is a pathway because there's so many different elements of carbon removal playing out across the board right now. So I think just thinking through how their skill sets can translate into carbon removal is great, as well as starting the conversation, having active, depending on where they are in a journey of either actively applying for jobs or having informational interviews with folks, just finding ways to step in and be engaged and enter into the space.
To conclude, we have a very important question. What's a fun fact about you that most people wouldn't guess from your professional bio?
Yeah, a fun final question. Something that's not in my bio yet because it's fairly new news is that at the start of the summer, I became a parent and had a baby boy.
Congratulations.
So that's been a great journey. And I think just the perspective of having a child now, it really hammers home this importance of the journey that you're on with climate action, I'm on with climate action, that viewers who are listening to this are on with climate action of what we're working towards is creating this safe climate future for the next generations. And so certainly I've been working on climate throughout my career, but it's taken on heightened impact and meaning since my exciting personal development.
That's amazing. Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And thank you for all of your work you're doing in this space. I'm sure your newborn child will really appreciate it as they grow up. And we're very grateful. Thank you, Ben, for taking the time to join this podcast, share about all the different work streams that the council is currently engaged in, and really grateful to have had you on the podcast.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you again. This was great.
Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.